where we are right now, Brendan, but here's an unprecedented question. If Donald Trump cannot attend in person, what effect would that have on the convention? I mean, would it rile up his base even more? And what do you think it would do for people who are still on the fence?
Yeah, I mean, I think that you have to, picture the scenario in which that's happening. If he is confined to his home, if he is sentenced in that way, I think that alone is going to rile up people. It's certainly, I don't think, again, good to that middle to have your nominee being sentenced and not being able to travel. When Donald Trump last week said that Milwaukee is a horrible city or something to that effect, I don't think that was an accident. I think he is very much aware that there is either a possibility or likelihood that he's not going to be able to be there. Now, that may not come to fruition, but it's clearly on his mind. I've been in enough of those rooms where he's rattling around, saying a bunch of nonsense, but there's usually something tied to it. So clearly something has gotten in his head, and he thinks that that's a possibility. And I think he's trying to, lay some groundwork as to why he may not be able to be there.
Does it help Democrats, Brittany, if Trump can't attend the highest profile GOP event of the presidential election cycle? I mean, can you imagine an acceptance speech from Mar-a-Lago?
I mean, listen, if I'm a Democratic operative, I am playing video of Donald Trump sitting at home, unable to attend his own nominating convention on constant loop. It will be on every single social media platform. It will be in every single commercial slot that I can find and afford, because I want that image out there to the American people. I want the American people to be very clear that if the Supreme Court and our other judicial institutions will not forbid a convicted felon from running for president, then we, the people, have to hold the line. And to be clear, it's not just about his present circumstance. It's about all of the things that he promised to do when he gets into office, because this is a person who keeps showing up in front of America as a loser. And when Donald Trump shows up as a loser, he vows to take out vengeance on anybody who pointed and laughed at him when that happened. He's promised a revengeful cabinet. He's promised a vengeful policy platform. Project 2025 is a reminder of just how vengeful not only Donald Trump, but this entire party can be. And now is the time for Democrats and, frankly, everyday people who are clued in to remind everyone they know of that.
And Brittany, what Brendan had referenced earlier, the fact that Donald Trump allegedly called Milwaukee, the host city of the RNC, a horrible city. I mean, how is that going to play out? I want to say that the Trump campaign denies he said it and says that, he was saying something about relative to crime. But how does that go down with Wisconsin voters?
Well, isn't it fascinating that the so-called cover that his operatives put forth was a narrative about crime and not the actual nature of the city? That, of course, is a dog whistle for Black people. Milwaukee, much like Baltimore, another city that he patently insulted in front of the country, is a city with a large Black population, a very proud Black population. And he continues to go after cities and locations and regions that have Black populations, Black leadership of color. And these dog whistles will still continue to appeal to the base, irrespective of what city he's talking about. So it might have been Milwaukee yesterday. It could be my hometown of St. Louis tomorrow. It could be Oakland, California the week after that. What we know to be true is that Donald Trump understands the dog whistles that are necessary for his core base, and so does the GOP. And they're going to keep saying those as loudly as they can, no matter how they try to throw rocks and hide their hands.
Look, Brendan, she has a point. That will appeal to his base. But does that do material damage to Trump's chances in a key swing state, which Wisconsin is?
Yeah, there's no smart play here. I mean, the only reason I could think that he would say such a thing is that he's trying to lay groundwork for not showing up. Wisconsin is one of the most important states that he has to win. I mean, it put him in the White House 8 years ago, and it was one of the ones that cost him 4 years ago. The constant problem with Donald Trump is that the things that he shoots from the hip always undermine good politics. in some ways, he actually has decent political instincts, but he can't help himself by doing things like this and revealing his true character. Maybe he thinks he's safe behind closed doors. He says all kinds of crazy stuff like this all the time, and there's been comparisons to Joe Biden and talking about Donald Trump's potential mind going and him slipping. He's always been like this. I've been in, years ago, I've been in rooms hearing him say stuff like this. So to me, the bigger thing is it reminds people that he is not a very stable person at a time we need pretty strong leadership. He's not really someone you can rely on.
So we're less than 2 weeks, Brendan, from the first debate between Trump and President Biden. The Biden campaign plans to let Trump be Trump and hope his extreme views and what you're describing, the meandering way of speaking, they're hoping it cures the Trump amnesia that we have talked about. Can a debate do that?
Yeah, I think it's going to be a fascinating debate. You typically talk about the incumbent president not doing very well in a debate because they haven't been challenged in a while. They're not used to having debates, and the challenger usually does very well. I think this is a situation where both of them are going to be facing that issue. Obviously, Donald Trump skipped all of the Republican primary debates. He hasn't debated in years. But this is also very clearly someone who's not used to being challenged. And when